Ladies and gentlemen, imagine standing at a historical inflection point and not just watching markets move, but feeling them shift beneath your feet. Today, we're not talking about a random price blip or a short-lived rally. We're talking about silver, a metal that is now crossing psychological and structural thresholds, surging towards $70 an ounce. And the forces behind this move are far bigger than any headline. They are the macro forces that shape economies, currencies, and global wealth. When you look at what's happening with silver right now, you can't treat it like a simple commodity story or a short-term price fluctuation. To understand why it's moving the way it is and why the momentum could push it toward levels people aren't prepared for, you have to zoom out and see the macro forces shaping everything beneath it. Markets don't behave randomly. They behave according to cause and affect relationships that repeat through history. And silver today is reacting to the same deep forces that have driven major economic turning points for centuries: debt cycles, monetary shifts, supply, demand imbalances, geopolitical tensions, and the psychological transitions that come when people lose confidence in traditional financial structures. The first major force is the long-term debt cycle. Every few decades, the world enters a period where accumulated debt becomes too large relative to income, forcing central banks and governments to step in with easing liquidity injections and shifts in monetary policy. We're in that stage again when debt is high and interest rates can't be pushed much higher without breaking the system. Authorities naturally move toward policies that weaken real yields. And whenever real yields fall, or even when the expectation of falling real yields grows, assets like silver benefit, because silver isn't just a metal, it's a form of financial insurance. It becomes more attractive when currencies lose real value. Investors aren't buying it because they suddenly love silver. They're buying it because they don't trust the purchasing power of the money they hold. Another force is the shift in global power dynamics. We're living in a world where economic dominance is being contested, trade relationships are changing, and the reliability of global supply chains is no longer taken for granted. Whenever geopolitical uncertainty rises, safe haven assets rise with it. But silver is unique because it doesn't only react to fear, it reacts to structural change. As different nations begin to diversify away from over-reliance on a single currency or region, hard assets naturally play a larger role in reserves, investment, and long-term strategic planning. Silver, despite being more volatile than gold, becomes an appealing secondary anchor for capital that wants protection and growth potential. Then there's the industrial cycle, which is often overlooked but increasingly critical. Unlike gold, a large portion of silver's demand comes from its industrial uses, especially in technologies that are accelerating faster than supply can match. Solar energy, electric vehicles, high-density batteries, AI hardware, robotics, medical devices, advanced computing all rely on silver's conductivity, antimicrobial properties, and energy efficiency. The world is not just using more silver, it's building entire infrastructures around technologies that require it. And once a technology becomes foundational, like solar or AI data centers, the demand for the materials behind it becomes non-negotiable. This is where the imbalance becomes unavoidable. Silver supply is relatively fixed in the short term. Mines can't expand production overnight. Most silver actually comes as a byproduct of mining for other metals, which means even when demand surges, supply doesn't automatically respond. This creates the kind of long-term squeeze where price doesn't just drift upward, it reprices sharply. When industrial demand rises, while investment demand rises simultaneously, something that rarely happens together, markets enter a scenario where the available above ground silver becomes the battleground for price discovery. Another important macro force is the decline of trust in institutions, especially financial ones. When people start feeling that official inflation numbers don't reflect their lived reality, or that purchasing power is eroding faster than the narrative suggests, they seek anchors. Hard assets, real, tangible, finite, become a psychological and financial refuge. Silver, being more affordable than gold, becomes the common person's hedge. And historically, whenever broad populations move toward hard assets at the same time as institutions do, prices accelerate disproportionately. We're also seeing the transition between monetary eras. Throughout history, there are moments when the world shifts from one currency regime to another, or when the role of money itself evolves. These transitions are subtle at first, changing reserve strategies, rising commodity prices, increased interest in alternative stores of value, and then they become obvious in hindsight. Silver's rise is one of those early signals. A system under stress begins to reveal itself through unexpected movements in assets that were once considered stable or slow-moving. Silver pushing towards significantly higher levels is not an isolated event. It's a symptom of underlying pressures building in the global financial environment. Finally, there is the psychological cycle. Markets move not only on fundamentals, but on collective beliefs. Once investors believe silver is entering a major repricing cycle, they behave in ways that reinforce that cycle. Buying accelerates, supply tightens, and the narrative becomes self-fulfilling. It's not irrational. It's how markets transition from one equilibrium to the next. So when silver pushes toward higher levels, it's not a surprise. It is the natural consequence of deeply rooted macro forces converging: debt cycles, monetary shifts, geopolitical uncertainty, industrial transformation, supply constraints, and changes in investor psychology all point in the same direction. The price is simply the visible reflection of these invisible forces. And whenever multiple long-term drivers align, the outcome is rarely modest. It becomes transformative. When you study silver through the lens of long-term cycles, you realize it occupies a uniquely powerful position that very few assets share. It sits at the intersection of two major forces that shape economies: the industrial cycle and the monetary cycle. And whenever an asset carries this dual nature, simultaneously essential to technological progress and trusted as a store of value, it becomes deeply sensitive to the shifts that occur in both the real economy and the financial system. This sensitivity is precisely what makes silver so reactive, so explosive in certain periods, and so important to understand today. On the industrial side, silver is not just a useful material. It's foundational. It has qualities no other metal and replicate at the same scale: unparalleled electrical conductivity, thermal efficiency, reflectivity, and antimicrobial properties. When you look at the economic transitions happening right now, almost all of them rely heavily on these exact characteristics. The accelerating shift towards solar energy, the expansion of electric vehicles, the rise of AI-driven data centers, the growth of high-density electronics, the push for green technologies, all of these depend on silver. Solar panels, for instance, are one of the biggest structural demand drivers of our era. As nations compete to bring down energy costs and secure long-term reliable energy sources, the global build-out of solar infrastructure has become unstoppable. Silver is a non-negotiable part of this process because its conductive efficiency cannot be substituted without significantly reducing performance. Every panel uses it. And as solar adoption spreads from the developed world into emerging markets, regions with rapidly growing energy needs, the demand curve steepens in a way that doesn't flatten easily. Electric vehicles follow the same logic. Every EV contains more silver than traditional combustion engines because of its wiring, battery interface, and electronic systems. As transportation shifts toward electrification, silver becomes a structural input rather than a cyclical one. The same is true for AI data centers, which require massive amounts of high-efficiency electrical components. These systems can't function without silver-intensive conductors and switches. This is the part of the cycle that's often missed. Industrial demand becomes stable and persistent when it's tied to global economic transformation, not temporary consumption trends. When technologies become essential infrastructure, the metals behind them become quietly indispensable. But silver doesn't stop there. It's also a monetary asset, something far rarer in the commodity world. Nations, institutions, and individuals use it as a hedge, a store of value, and a form of protection during periods of monetary instability. That means silver reacts to financial forces with the same sensitivity it reacts to industrial forces, and this dual exposure creates a powerful amplification effect. Whenever real interest rates decline, when currencies weaken, or when inflation expectations rise, monetary assets gain strength. Silver, being held by investors for these reasons, sees increased demand. But unlike gold, its monetary demand stacks on top of massive industrial needs that don't disappear when financial conditions change. In other words, silver is influenced by the real economy and the financial system at the same time, a rare position that increases its volatility and upside potential. If you observe monetary cycles historically, you notice patterns. When debt levels reach extremes, when money creation accelerates, and when trust in fiat systems declines, people migrate toward hard assets. That's not a matter of ideology. It's a matter of self-preservation. They want assets that cannot be printed, devalued, or inflated away. Silver becomes particularly attractive in these stages because it's accessible. Gold is the choice of institutions and wealthy capital pools, but silver becomes the hedge of ordinary populations, and when the masses move, waves grow quickly. This is the foundation of silver's monetary surge: distrust in the currency system. Not emotional distrust, but analytical distrust, recognizing that inflation erodes purchasing power, that debt levels are unsustainable, that policy decisions create distortions, and that financial assets don't always reflect real economic value in these environments. Silver's monetary role activates, aligning it with gold and other stores of value. But here's where things become interesting: when both roles, industrial and monetary, activate simultaneously, silver enters a rare phase of compounded demand. This is what creates explosive price moves. Industrial buyers cannot slow down because supply chains depend on silver. Monetary buyers will not slow down because they're protecting wealth. Both sides compete for the same limited supply. Compounding this is the fact that silver supply is relatively rigid. Most silver doesn't come from primary silver mines. It's produced as a byproduct of mining for other metals. That means even when silver prices rise, supply doesn't increase proportionally because miners respond to the economics of other metals, not silver itself. This structural limitation makes the dual role demand cycle even more powerful. When an asset becomes essential to both the functioning of the modern economy and the preservation of financial stability, the forces acting upon it create a kind of tightening spiral. And as that spiral intensifies, the price begins to reflect not only current conditions, but future expectations of further industrial dependence, continued monetary stress, and rising competition for limited supply. This is why silver's future potential isn't merely a matter of speculation. It's embedded in the mechanics of how economies evolve and how financial systems respond to stress. When the industrial cycle and the monetary cycle converge, the outcome is rarely mild. It becomes transformative because the asset sits at the center of two systems that govern how the world works: the system of production and the system of value. Silver is one of the few assets that belong fully to both. And when both systems shift at the same time, as they are now, the results tend to be dramatic. When people talk about silver reaching 70, many assume it's a speculative figure, something driven by hype or emotion. But when you trace the underlying mechanics, you see that the path towards $70 isn't built on excitement. It's built on a series of structural pressures that have been building for years. Silver doesn't move sharply unless something in the foundation of the economic system shifts. And right now, several deep forces are converging, creating the conditions for a major repricing event. To understand how silver gets to 70D, you have to start with how markets revalue assets during transitions. Rarely does an asset multiply in price because of a single factor. Instead, it happens when the environment changes in a way that makes the old price assumptions irrelevant. Silver is entering one of those phases. The traditional pricing model, which assumed moderate demand, stable monetary conditions, predictable industrial usage, and a steady supply pipeline, no longer reflects reality. The world that created 2025 silver is not the world we are living in now, and markets always adjust when conditions fundamentally shift. One of the most important drivers of the move towards 70 EOs is the tightening of physical supply. The silver market is historically thin, meaning that even relatively small changes in buying behavior can shift prices dramatically. But what's happening now is not a small change, it's structural. Industrial demand continues to rise with no realistic path for supply to match it. Large investors have started accumulating physical silver as a hedge, taking material off the market. Sovereign mints have reported shortages and delays. Refiners are working at capacity, and mining output has plateaued because most silver is a byproduct of other mining operations, which means production can't increase simply because silver prices rise. This creates a dynamic where available above ground silver becomes the deciding factor, and that pool is shrinking. When both industrial users and monetary investors need the same metal at the same time, bottlenecks form. Bottlenecks always lead to price discovery, fast, sharp, and often shocking. That's one of the core forces pushing silver towards 70 EA. The next major element is the shift in monetary conditions. Long-term debt cycles eventually force policymakers into positions where they must choose between tightening and sustaining the system. When debt burdens are too high, tightening becomes impossible without triggering a collapse. So the natural outcome is a shift toward easing, liquidity injections, or policies that weaken currencies to keep financial conditions manageable. In such environments, real yields decline and assets that protect purchasing power become more attractive. Silver benefits more than most because it amplifies these monetary shifts. It's not only a hedge against currency debasement, it's an accelerator when confidence erodes. Investors turn to it when they sense the underlying value of their money is weakening. And once that psychological shift happens, flows into hard assets tend to grow exponentially, not linearly. When confidence breaks, it doesn't decline gradually, it resets. That reset often triggers rapid repricing of monetary metals, with silver displaying more volatility and upside potential than gold due to its smaller market size. Another important driver is technological and industrial evolution, which is intensifying silver's role in the global economy. Solar installations, EVs, advanced electronics, and AI hardware are not cyclical trends. They are long-term structural transformations. They represent a re-engineering of the global energy and technological landscape. Silver's irreplaceable role in these technologies makes it a strategic material, not merely a commodity. As governments push aggressively toward renewable energy targets and as tech infrastructure expands to support data-driven economies, silver demand becomes insensitive to price. Industrial users don't stop buying because the price rises. They simply pass costs through the supply chain because their production processes depend on it. This is one of the most powerful forces in any market, inelastic demand meeting constrained supply. It creates the kind of upward pressure that can push an asset far beyond previously accepted price ceilings. Then we must consider global capital flows. In times of uncertainty or macroeconomic transition, capital often shifts out of high-risk financial assets and into tangible stores of value. Silver, being affordable, accessible, and deeply tied to real economic needs, becomes an appealing destination for both retail and institutional capital. And when capital flows accelerate, they create momentum. Momentum shifts expectations. Expectations change behavior. That behavior creates the next wave of capital flows. These feedback loops are how markets transition from one price regime to another. The path towards 70 DRs also involves a crucial psychological component. Markets rarely move simply because of fundamentals. They move because people recognize those fundamentals at the same time. When enough market participants begin to understand that the old pricing assumptions no longer apply, the narrative shifts. And once the narrative shifts, price action follows. The shift is happening now. Analysts who once dismissed higher silver prices as unrealistic are beginning to reconsider. Investors who ignored silver are now exploring hedges. Industrial users are locking in contracts earlier to avoid volatility. All major price revaluations throughout history share this pattern. Fundamentals tighten, monetary conditions shift, demand rises, supply struggles. But the move doesn't happen until psychology aligns. When it does, the adjustment tends to be sharp and fast, not gradual. So the path towards $70 is not speculative. It is the logical outcome of structural forces converging, limited supply, rising industrial demand, shifting monetary conditions, global realignments, and evolving investor psychology all point toward a repricing event. And when an asset sits at the intersection of these major cycles, the outcome is rarely moderate. It becomes transformative. Silver's move toward $70 is not the destination. It's the threshold of a much larger transition in how the market values real assets in a changing world. Once silver reaches $70, the story doesn't end. In fact, that price level will likely mark the beginning of a far more profound phase of market transformation because the significance of silver at this stage goes far beyond a simple numerical milestone. When an asset like silver, one that straddles both industrial necessity and monetary function, breaches a psychologically and structurally important level, it begins to reveal the deeper dynamics that shape the global economy. The market doesn't just react to numbers. It reacts to what those numbers represent: shifts in supply, demand equilibrium, changes in monetary trust and transformations in how capital is allocated. The first and most immediate effect of crossing $7 will be a recalibration of market perception. Investors, industrial buyers, and policymakers alike will begin to recognize that silver is not merely a commodity to trade or a hedge to hold passively. It is a signal of broader systemic pressures. Markets operate on expectations, and once the expectation changes, behavior changes. Large institutional investors will reassess their allocations, seeing silver not only as a protective asset, but as a strategic hedge in a world where fiat currencies are increasingly perceived as unstable. This reassessment triggers flows that can reinforce the price movement, creating momentum that propels silver further. At the same time, industrial users will confront new realities as silver becomes more expensive. Industries that rely heavily on it may attempt incremental efficiency gains, substitution, or recycling to manage costs, but in many high-tech applications, solar panels, electric vehicles, AI data centers, and medical devices, substitutes either do not exist or come at prohibitive cost. This creates a structural imbalance. Demand remains rigid while supply cannot increase quickly, exerting sustained upward pressure on prices. The result is a dynamic where silver's value is increasingly determined by scarcity and necessity rather than speculative flows alone. Global capital flows will also evolve as silver proves its ability to preserve value and to appreciate during periods of monetary stress. It will attract a broader class of investors. Hedge funds, sovereign wealth funds, and emerging market central banks will likely increase exposure not merely to speculate, but to diversify risk and protect purchasing power. The inflow of this capital will amplify volatility, but also solidify silver's status as a systemic asset. Once an asset is recognized as systemic, small changes in perception or policy can lead to outsized moves, creating periods of rapid repricing that are far more dramatic than incremental gains. Another critical development will be the psychological shift in market confidence. When silver exceeds levels that were previously considered extreme, it validates fears about currency debasement, inflation, and the limitations of traditional financial instruments. Individuals and institutions who have resisted holding tangible assets may feel compelled to enter, not because of greed, but because of necessity. This wave of participation can become self-reinforcing. More demand drives higher prices, which in turn attracts more participants, creating a feedback loop that pushes the market into a new equilibrium. History shows that these cycles often accelerate once a key price threshold is breached. At a macro level, the move beyond $70 will reflect broader monetary and economic transitions. The world is navigating a period of extraordinarily high debt, low interest rates, and complex financial interdependencies. Assets that provide both industrial utility and monetary security gain attention, not only as hedges, but as indicators of how global capital is being reallocated. Silver at $70 is not just a price point. It is a signal that the underlying structures of wealth preservation and industrial reliance are beginning to dominate investor priorities. It hints at a reordering of portfolios, the emergence of new risk paradigms, and a reconsideration of how markets value tangible versus financial assets. Geopolitical factors also come into play. As silver's value rises, nations may reassess their roles in securing resources critical to technological and industrial sovereignty. Strategic reserves may increase, export controls could tighten, and international competition for access may intensify. These dynamics create additional upward pressure on price, not simply from investment demand, but from structural scarcity. Silver, unlike purely financial instruments, reflects both economic and geopolitical realities. Its movement signals how nations perceive risk, opportunity, and the limits of conventional policy tools. The final and perhaps most transformative consequence is the shift in market narrative. Crossing $70 will change the story from a speculative rally to a structural revaluation. Analysts, commentators, and participants will begin framing silver as more than a commodity. It becomes a barometer for systemic risk, technological growth, and monetary evolution. When markets adopt a new narrative, behavior changes from asset allocation to corporate investment decisions, reinforcing the new paradigm. This narrative effect amplifies price action in ways that fundamentals alone cannot explain, and it can persist for years, creating an extended period of structural realignment. In short, what comes after $7? A phase of revelation and reorientation. The number itself is not the climax. It is the threshold beyond which investors, industries, and policymakers begin to respond to the deeper signals embedded in the market. It will be a period where the interplay of scarcity, industrial necessity, monetary concern, and investor psychology creates conditions for sustained upward momentum. Price moves may become more volatile, but the underlying forces driving the market will be more transparent. The dual pressures of structural industrial demand and systemic monetary recalibration. Silver's ascent beyond $70 will not merely represent a new high in dollars per ounce. It will mark a turning point in how the global economy, financial systems, and capital flows interact, setting the stage for a period of profound transformation. So what comes next won't shock because of a number. It will shock because it will reframe how we see markets and money. When silver breaks perceived ceilings, it isn't only a price milestone, it's a signal that markets are pricing in changing economic realities, that capital is repositioning, and that investors are increasingly thinking in terms of value preservation and transformation rather than short-term gains. Remember, the real force in markets isn't a price, it's people understanding why prices move. And when we grasp that, we see not just a number like I-70D, but a story of economic evolution unfolding before our eyes. Let's be ready for that story, because what comes after may well define the next decade of investing.